We're going to go ahead and get started so we can stay on time. So welcome everybody to the May workshop. I have a few housekeeping items to go over before Adam takes over. So we've got our distribution tomorrow. That'll be 4 to 6. If you have not signed up for a time to pick up, please do so. We're giving out lots of things and we don't want to keep them in the office. So please sign up for a time. The address and all that stuff I sent out in the email. We did find out that Topper Academy is a voting location tomorrow, which is so fun. However, I think it'll be okay. We have lots of parking and there will be parking along the road that you can kind of pull off and we'll like try and load into your car. We did not know that until yesterday, so too late to change. But yeah, so I did want to say a couple things. We will try and fill your plant orders as accurately as possible. Sometimes we do make mistakes. Be gracious with us. And as far as your seed orders go, there were a few things that we ran out of. I think cantaloupe, green onions, and something else random. So if you don't have that in your order, we're very sorry. We did try and get it to everybody. But if you want more of something because you didn't get something, then just let me know and we'll try and get it to you. You guys did order sweet potatoes. Those will not be here tomorrow. We will be doing a separate distribution for them later in May because we get them from a local farmer and they won't be ready till late May. Frost dates. So it looks like the 10-day forecast is good. Seems like we had our last frost date, hopefully. So you should be good to plant the plants that you receive tomorrow. You don't have to wait at all, so yay. And then I really wanted to try and get pest and disease control out to you guys tomorrow, but it did not happen. So I will be doing a pest and disease control pickup in the next couple of weeks, and I'll email out for that. The only thing we don't have in yet, we did not get half of our hose in that we ordered. So we will get that probably this week. So half of the first year gardeners will get them tomorrow, and then half will get them at the pest and disease control handout. So, and then I also just wanted to address a couple of questions I've been getting about harvest totals. You do have harvest totals due on Friday. If you don't have them, that's totally fine. We did just plant our spring stuff, so we're not really expecting you to have any. But please do check in with me. Let me know that you don't have any, and that just lets me know that you're all engaged, being an active participant. I've also been asked if we didn't hand out stuff to you, if you still turn in harvest totals for things you're growing. And the answer is yes. So if you've got blueberry bushes or apple trees or anything else that you're growing, please still turn those into us because we are, you know, supporting you as a gardener, and all the things that you're growing go into our reporting. So I guess if you have any other questions for harvest totals, just email me. I sent an email out kind of detailing what we expect from you and all that, but if you have any other questions, just let me know. I'm going to pass it over to Adam. He is our Washington County Extension agent, and he is graciously filling in for Lexi because she is getting ready to have a baby. So take it away, Adam.
Thank you. So how many people here or online have actually interfaced with the Extension office before? So a few have, so good. If you're not familiar with the Extension, we kind of bridge the gap between the wider community and the land-grant universities. And so what my job is, I'm one of our 3 agriculture agents, and my focus is on horticulture. So I work with farmers as well as homeowners, basically on plant questions. We have another ag agent who focuses on livestock and forages, and we have one that just officially started as an agent today. She was previously our program assistant, who is focusing on youth agriculture as well as more of a business side of agriculture. So we all kind of have our special hats and we all help each other out. A lot of people are familiar with Extension because of 4-H, but we do a lot of other things too. Everything from cooking and cleaning classes, sewing, any number of different things. But today I get the opportunity to talk with you about diseases. So we'll talk about disease management in the home garden. We're going to primarily be focusing kind of more on an organic control perspective. My background in organics, for 4.5 years, I actually ran an organic certifier for the state of Kentucky. So when you buy organic products, those farms or facilities that are making the product actually get inspected and evaluated, make sure that the product really is organic. And so I did that for about 4.5 years. So I've got a good understanding of organic from that side, and my college education, horticulture science. So hopefully we'll put the two together and go from there. So are you going to advance the slides?
Yes.
Please go ahead. So let me just mention, we will be talking about some brand names or trade names tonight. That does not imply endorsement, nor does it, shade anything on something I don't mention. We just use these as examples. Nothing I say is exhaustive. If we are talking about pesticides, which we will be, always follow label directions. Nothing I say here, nothing you read on the internet trumps the label. The label is the law, so we always have to follow those directions. Next slide. So when we look at organic gardening, yes.
Can we get email of all these PowerPoints by chance?
You can. I happened to print them out for everybody and left them in my office. Well, I know. So what I probably will do is just provide them to Rosie and let her send them out. So yeah, I'm sorry you don't have that with you tonight. We had the great plan and I failed.
I just want to know how much does it take. So.
Yeah. So whenever we look at organic gardening, or even on a commercial scale, or organic is much more of a systems approach. If you're used to gardening conventionally or even ag as a whole, we want to approach it with a little bit different mindset. Sometimes people think of it as it's just the absence of inputs. And by inputs, I mean whether we're talking about fertility products, pest control products, or anything else. It's not. It's actually the judicious use of inputs. For instance, if we're harvesting out of our garden, we're removing nutrients that plant eats. So for every pound of tomatoes we take out, we're taking out nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium and calcium, magnesium, etc. And if we keep doing that without putting anything back, we're just mining our soil. And eventually we'll have a problem that our soils aren't productive. So we want to make sure that we're actually using inputs as we need. And a big focus of organic gardening is creating a system that lets us succeed. And so we're looking at doing healthy soil because that means healthy plants. And we have healthy plants, they're better able to resist pests that do show up, and we have better yields. So it is kind of a bigger view picture than just what do I need to do for this. Next slide, please. You often hear integrated pest management when folks are talking about pest control for good reason. IPM is just basically, in a very short nutshell, saying you don't first reach for a chemical control. On a commercial level for producers, we have very specific thresholds where X number of an insect per so many row feet or square footage of plants either would trigger or not an application of a product. It's very much based on economics. Is it actually going to pay to control for this pest? But certainly we still can pull out a lot of good points from integrated pest management, even if we don't have those identified thresholds for the home garden. And among those, and we'll talk about some of these further on, crop rotation to limit pests in our garden, resistant varieties when possible, some things we don't have great resistance to, making sure we have an environment that promotes that healthy plant, so adequate fertility, water, and then other strategies we can do before we reach for a chemical control product, such as exclusion, removal, timing, sanitation, or even other things. Next slide. So in general, when we're talking about utilizing pest control products, and when I use the word pesticide, that's a very big umbrella term. Pesticide just means something that kills something else. So it's everything from herbicides that kill the weeds, insecticides that kill insects, fungicides that kill funguses, bactericides that kill bacteria, rodenticides that kill rodents, miticides that kill mites, and so on. It's a big umbrella term. And sometimes people get confused on that. But by and large, when we talk about organic approved or allowed pest control products, they're essentially non-synthetic or natural in origin. That's what distinguishes organic from conventional ag. The origin is non-synthetic or natural, if you prefer. So we're basically looking at some major categories, products that are derived from plant oils, from minerals, or biological organisms or their derivatives. In some instances, it's actually a living organism like a bacteria, and others, it's a bacteria produced byproduct that we're actually using for a control agent. Even though these are organic, even though they may be natural, we still have to follow the label. There are even organic pesticides that can cause problems for pollinators, for instance. We can kill pollinators with organic pesticides if we want to, especially if we're using them incorrectly. And just as an example, here was a study I just real quick did a search, acute toxicity and sublethal effects of botanical insecticides to honeybees. So here we have plant-derived insecticides, many of which would absolutely be allowed for use in certified organic production, but yet they're having negative consequences for honeybees. So just because we have a product that's organic doesn't mean we can just use it casually without following the directions. You may be asking yourself, do I have to spray in my garden? It really kind of depends. And so maybe the correct answer is maybe, because it depends what crops we're talking about and what pests we're worried about in our garden. It's very critical about what kind of year we're having. We will have way more pests, especially diseases in wet years than you will in a dry year. And you'll actually have some different insect pests in a very dry year than you might in a normal year. So weather does play a real role and problems we will or won't have in the garden. The other thing is, what's your threshold level for damage on your crop? If you don't mind eating around the bad parts of something, you may not spray very much. It may not be a problem. On the other hand, there are some diseases that they get a foothold, they can wipe out a crop. And so depending on what disease we're talking about, there are times when we probably really should do some control, or you need to be prepared that you may lose that. And that may be perfectly fine. Most of us probably aren't relying on our gardens as our sole source of food. If we have a crop failure, you can go to the farmer's market, you can go to the grocery store. So, depending what your level of tolerance of damage is, may not be a big priority for you to be doing pest control. But certainly what we have to keep in mind, the same environment that allows us to grow plants well will also grow plant pests well. And so we can almost always have some sort of problem happening in the garden, and we hope to keep it at a level that it's not a giant, enormous problem for us. Next slide. The best disease control strategy is prevention. And so we'll talk a little bit about these, but prevention will include, different cultural practices we can do. We'll support that with pesticide usage. Again, but even with pesticides, we have to understand we have curative products and we have preventative products. Curative products, we walk out, we find the problem, we spray something, it's dead. It fixed the problem, cures it. With organic, by and large, we're dealing with preventative products because the nature of the products themselves, they do not do a great job of rescue treatments. And so that means really we need to catch things very, very early, and in some cases, even before they get well established at all. And so because of that, that does kind of inform some of our actions in the garden. Next slide. So cultural practices we can use to our advantage. Select disease-resistant plants or cultivars. So in some instances, we have good options with this. Healthy soils is another one we'll talk about. Good airflow is important. Sanitation in the garden. End of season cleanup, I think, is critically important, both for insect and disease problems. If we're reusing containers, so if we're growing our own transplants, doing some sanitation with those is important as well. And crop rotation is one that doesn't take a huge amount of effort on our part, but I think can give some very good results. So disease-resistant varieties. Tomatoes is a great one to talk about because there's a lot of disease-resistant varieties out there. So if you look on seed packets or look in catalogs, when you see that string of letters that really looks kind of like nonsense to us, those are very specifically mentioning different diseases that that particular tomato has resistance to. We do need to understand resistance is not the same thing as immunity. So if we have a weakened plant, if we have very high disease pressure, we can still have significant loss from a resistant plant. It just means it's going to be less affected than a plant that doesn't have resistance. So it's not immunity, unfortunately. We can find out this information from catalogs, seed packets. Typically, we find greater resistance with more modern varieties because they've been specifically bred for that. They will purposely create a new cultivar that has resistance to different diseases. Not every pest has a resistant variety to it. So just because we have a prevalent pest doesn't mean you have an option to choose a resistant variety. It's just not possible with some. Later on, I'll mention that Cornell has a very good source. If you're really wanting to look for resistant varieties, they've got a good resource for you. And I'll talk about that later when we get to the end. When we're talking about healthy soils, and we do want to say soils and not dirt, the soils are alive and living. And so, what is a healthy soil? Well, one, I think we have to say it has to be productive. And so that means that we have sufficient nutrients there for the production we're wanting to do. And it also means we have to make sure that we're adding back in that fertility as we remove it with harvest. We actually need adequate pore space. So this is where raised beds can actually be a good thing. There's some extra costs associated with raised beds, but one of the things about it is typically we don't see compaction issues because pore space in soil is where air and water reside. And what happens when soils become compacted is you don't have air and water. If you don't have air, your roots die. If you don't have roots, your plants die. And so we want to make sure that we do have adequate pore space there. So preventing compaction of our soils is important. And also a healthy soil is going to be microbiologically active. And so, this allows us to cycle nutrients in the soil, break down organic amendments we are adding. There are symbiotic relationships between fungi and plants that can greatly enhance their ability to grant nutrients. We can actually even deny a place for bad microbes to grow if we have a healthy, robust microbe community already there. So there's a lot of reasons to make sure that we are keeping our soils alive. One of the best things we can do to our soils is add organic matter. And in this case, organic matter has nothing to do with organic certification or regulations. We're just saying something that's once alive. So typically we're talking about things like compost, which is various forms of plant matter. It can be composted animal manures, leaves, hay, straw, bark, wood chips, almost anything that was once alive. The reason we like adding it to soils, this feeds the biology of our soil, and it also increases the organic matter content of our soils, which basically is almost like increasing the shelving in our soils. So now we have more places for nutrients and water to both hang out too. We do want to be aware that we can have issues with persistent herbicides. This can come from lawn clippings, but more commonly it's coming from manure or hay, because what happens is a lot of these products are more often used in forage production for animals. The animal eats the hay, it passes through them, and the manure still contains active herbicides. And so these herbicides are going to cause problems with our broadleaf plants. Corn is not going to be such a problem because they're broadleaf weeds, weed killers or herbicides. And so corn being a grass isn't a problem, but things like tomatoes and beans, especially, peas would also be included, are very sensitive to it. So we'll see problems with these with twisted, distorted growth, strapping leaves. This is something that generally I get 3 to 5 calls a season on. So if you're utilizing manure, even composted manure, because believe it or not, composting manure may actually make the herbicides last longer because of the stability of humus. You have to know the source of the feed for the animals. So if someone's offering you manure, ask them, are they buying in any forages? If they are they using any of the broadleaf weed herbicide like aminopyralids in the production of those forages? If they're purchasing forage in, I would say don't use it because they don't know what's happening to it. Perfectly fine for the animals, not a problem for the animal. It is just going to hurt our broadleaf plants in the garden. So just be aware. Yes.
Okay, so I'm trying to make sure I understand this. So what we've been doing is we have chickens that we've been raising and organically we're feeding them. But instead of buying like hay and stuff, we're actually taking our lawn clippings, using this for bedding. And then once we're cleaning that out of their thing, we take that and we just put that into our composter. But we don't use anything on our grass and stuff, so that should be okay.
Absolutely. So the basic question was, they're using their own lawn clippings. They know they're not applying herbicide to that lawn. Is there any concerns? No, because you know what's happening to that grass. And so, I mean, that's a great way. You have, trees in your yard, and you're raking up the leaves. You don't want to smother the lawn, throw it on the garden. The tree leaves aren't going to be a problem. You know what's happening on your own lawn. If you are utilizing herbicides on your lawn, don't put it in. It's one of those things you can be informed with that. And sometimes that's the missing key when someone's giving you manure. You don't know what happened to that forage product. So great question. Another thing we can do for healthy soils is reducing soil disturbances. So low till or no till. You actually don't have to till soil to have a successful garden. It does help to establish a garden in the beginning, especially if you're following turf. So it's not the worst thing in the world either, but repeated tilling literally cuts up your soil into smaller pieces, which reduces some of the physical characteristics we would like to see with soil. And it also breaks down organic matter faster because it chops it up in smaller pieces, increases surface area, and our microbiological community is able to consume it faster. That's kind of bad because we want to preserve that, or at least balance the preservation and the consumption of it, because we do get nutrients for our plants. So reducing soil disturbances and tillage is always a plus for us. We want to keep our soils covered, as counterintuitive as it is. Soil that has plants living on it actually has greater percolation of water through it than a soil that's tilled. Same thing with mulch. We never want to have bare soils. A lot of old gardeners will till their gardens in the fall or winter and leave it bare for months on end. You're doing nothing good for your garden when you do that. Always have it covered. If not by a living cover crop, then do it with mulch. And a big one for us, and I think one that, this is one of those things that doesn't really take money to do necessarily, so it's always a great payback, rotation of crop families. So when you're planting the same crop families in the same place year after year, you're just inviting diseases to build up, because basically you're providing the inoculum, the source for the next season's disease, if you don't get every little particulate matter of that prior crop out of it, which you won't. And so by rotating through different families, it doesn't matter if you have a solanaceous family pest there next spring, because now there's broccoli there. And it's not going to attack broccoli, and it's not going to cause any problems. In fact, it's going to die. It's not going to survive. So by rotating different crop families, you're able to have basically good control. If you can do it for 3 years to where you don't plant the same family in the same spot, within 3 years, that's great. Longer is good. There's no such thing as too long of a rotation. Lots of times in gardens, it may only be flip-flopping from end to end. But if you have the ability to maybe actually have more than one garden site, I can let you do a little bit more with cover cropping and green manures, which can be good. But as much as you can do is better. Water and irrigation. Obviously, we probably all learned in 2nd grade or something, plants need water. So understand, one, the amount that plants need does change over the season. It's a function of not only the climate of the season as our temperatures increase as we go into summer, but also the size of the plants and what they're doing. Also understand that too much water can be just as detrimental as too little water. Earlier, I was talking about pore space, that air and water hang out in the same place. If we saturate our soils and fill up all our pore space with water, there's no air there. There's no oxygen for those roots, and we can kill our plants. This is why if you're doing any sort of container, make absolutely sure there's holes in it where it can drain. Or if you're doing some sort of potted plant, you have a nice pretty outer pot, and you have an inner pot, pull out the inner pot to drain and then put it back in the pretty one when it's done, because we don't want plants sitting in water, because unless they're specifically adapted to that situation, to a swamp or a bog, we will kill them because we will smother the roots literally. So understand that too much water is just bad. Sometimes I run across people who say, in a rainy season, I'm like, oh, I bet the farmers are just loving this. It's like, no, Too much is bad. Too little is bad. We need that happy medium. Mulching in our garden is good to help us manage water because it reduces the soil temperature, which is good during most of the garden season. Very early in the spring when we want our soils to warm up, we don't want heavy mulch in place necessarily, so actually raking it back. If we're putting out something very early to allow better sun exposure, it's not a bad thing because again, it's just a small part of the garden. It's not a broad area. And this helps moderate and makes moisture more even, which is important for things such as blossom end rot. So blossom end rot primarily on tomatoes, often on peppers, and it can even show up on things like yellow squash, is all about calcium availability, which is actually a watering issue because calcium gets into the plant by the mass flow of water. Different nutrients get in different ways. And so when we have uneven watering in the garden, we basically don't get enough calcium consistently delivered to those developing fruit, whether tomato, pepper, or even squash. And then those cell layers fail to basically glue together. That's why it's on the blossom end of that fruit. And that's why it kind of looks sunken if you've ever seen it happen. You have no idea what I'm talking about. Look it up online and you'll see. But it's all about water availability, not about calcium in your soil in our region. We have plenty of calcium in our soils. But do you actually have delivery to that plant consistently, or is it up and down because we water every now and again rather than more even? We do want to avoid leaf wetness if possible. So things like soaker hoses and drip irrigation gives us an advantage this way. They actually use less water because you're really using less to evapotranspiration from the soils. So particularly if you're paying for it, that can help offset some of the costs. If you do overhead water, make sure that you do it earlier in the day so there's time for it to dry out. So we wouldn't want to go out and water overhead later in the evening when we get home from work, because then it's going to stay wetter for a longer period of time. Wet leaf surfaces are wonderful for any number of different fungal pathogens. They need those wet surfaces basically to germinate in a way analogous to seeds germinate. So anytime we can minimize leaf wetness, we're helping ourselves. Good airflow, back to leaf wetness. So proper spacing, so we see recommendations on the back of our seed packages or in any number of garden reference materials. They're a good thing to go by. How you orient your rows. If you know you consistently have a breeze from the southwest, orient your rows so they can actually benefit from that and have nice good airflow up and down those rows. Reducing weeds helps improves air circulation. In greenhouses, when we're growing plants, we actually have fan systems in there called horizontal airflow systems, or HAF. We have those in there because what happens is, you know, plant leaves lose water. It's how they keep cool. They transpire the water. What happens is you can actually get a boundary layer right against those leaves that's very humid, and also it becomes deprived of CO2. So in greenhouses, we actually have fan systems set up to make sure that air is turbulent. So we don't have still air around those plant leaves, so we don't end up with high humid conditions around the leaf, which is enough for some diseases. They don't even have to be literally wet. Just high humidity is a bad thing. But also we don't have a layer of air that's devoid of CO2 next to that leaf, because that's going to slow photosynthesis. By the same token, we can get those conditions when we have a lot of plants in a small place outside. So the better airflow, removing weeds, so we get more air into a plant. Pruning as appropriate. So not everything in our gardens needs to be pruned. Indeterminate tomatoes are one that we do often recommend pruning. But certainly sometimes if you're in a smaller place, you may have something that's overgrowing the space, and so you may prune it. So it's not necessarily something we're going to do for every crop. But there are times when pruning can help us maintain good airflow. Excellent question. So what is an indeterminate tomato? A non-determinate tomato. So basically there are two broad categories of tomatoes. Maybe we can throw in a third. But indeterminate basically says it keeps growing until it dies. So these are the ones that really overgrow the tomato cage, cover over the whole garden, but you're picking for a very long period of time on those tomatoes. Determinate tomatoes grow to a determined height, generally 4 to 5 feet. They stop, and that's all you're going to get. So determinate, or sometimes called bush tomatoes. There's also dwarf tomatoes that are smaller than determinates, but basically indeterminates grow until frost. Determinates stop once they reach a certain size. And so because of that, we have a more concentrated harvest with determinates. And indeterminates, we have a longer period of harvest.
We give out indeterminate.
Give out indeterminates. So those would be ones that would benefit from removing the suckers on the tomato plant. And suckers are just adventitious shoots, which is basically a shoot that's arising in between a main branch and the main trunk. And basically you leave one below the first flower cluster and remove any below that. It just helps limit the amount of plant you have there, helps speed ripening for the earlier flowers, because it's not growing a big plant at the same time trying to ripen fruit. You kind of balance it. Determinate tomatoes, because they're a finite size, we typically don't prune those. If we prune them, they might actually reach maturity a little faster, but we'd be removing yield. So we don't do that. So excellent question. And actually tomorrow night, I've got a webinar when we talk about tomatoes and peppers. So it's one of my slides from the webinar. So I prepared to answer that. So sanitation. I think with COVID, we've all heard about this before probably. And basically the same steps we talk about preventing transmission of diseases in people, same thing with our garden. Sanitation is sanitation at the end of the day. So we don't want to introduce disease. So, you know, if you see plants, you know, at a store that you're buying and they look like they don't look good, don't buy them, because we don't want to bring the disease into the garden. There's one disease we'll mention later, latent blight, which affects solanaceous crops. So tomatoes, peppers, potatoes. That is one that very often originates on transplants. It's not something you'll find in your home garden. We don't have it a lot in our area. We can't get it. But most often when there's a problem, it goes back to large national plant suppliers had a problem in the greenhouse. If we're reusing pots or trays or anything like that in the garden, we want to make sure we wash, rinse, and sanitize and follow label directions on a sanitizer. So like Clorox, for instance, believe it or not, it's actually an antimicrobial pesticide according to the EPA. If you take the EPA registration number on the back label that nobody ever looks at, you'll actually find there's like a 53-page label that goes with that product. And it gives you all sorts of directions on how to use it, some of which apply directly to agriculture. For instance, you can do produce washing with a Clorox product that's registered properly. But just understand all the directions on that for the rate. If we're borrowing tools or equipment, we'd ideally like to see those washed before we use them, so we're not bringing in soil from somewhere else into our garden. There's certainly any number of diseases that can be soil-borne, and if we're bringing in equipment from somewhere else, that has to be a concern for us. If this was a group of tobacco growers, I could ask you, hey, can you spread black shank from field to field on equipment? Tobacco growers knew absolutely that would happen. We can do that with any number of different diseases that can affect our garden. Tobacco use. So if you're a tobacco user, you need to be very careful when it comes to especially your tomatoes, because there are viruses that can be in the tobacco product, cigarettes, snuff, dip, whatever, that can get on your hands, and then you transfer those virus particles to your plants. So you can actually infect your tomato plants because you are a smoker.
From growing tobacco, my husband got plug up his button, wanted to try growing tobacco. This is those tiny little things that he's putting next to the garden.
So if you're growing tobacco in the garden, or if you're growing Nicotiana in the landscape bed, which is just a tobacco, it's not necessarily going to have the virus present. So just because there's a tobacco plant around doesn't mean there absolutely is a virus there. But there's a risk factor there that if that tobacco plant becomes infected with a virus and then an aphid is eating on the tobacco and then hops into the garden, yes, it could be spread. Now, what's the likelihood? I don't know, but theoretically it could happen. But definitely, so, you know, a lot of, you know, if you're having tomato greenhouse and everything, you would have very strict hand washing requirements on workers that use tobacco, because they can quite readily transfer a virus into your grow operation. One thing we can do with sanitation, and sometimes this may be hard to swallow, but if we have a plant that isn't doing well, whether it's infested with insects, whether it's infected by a disease, rip it out. I'd rather lose one plant than have it spread to the whole patch. And so the other thing we need to do, so a lot of our gardens, you know, tomatoes, for instance, we are right at the time when I would suggest you start planting tomatoes out. Rosie was spot on with that. I wouldn't do it before May 1st most years. We can plant tomatoes from May 1st up until towards the end of July. If you still have the plants from May 1st sitting in there when you're planting those in July, those one from May are probably done, or they're looking ragged. They've seen a lot of work. Most of the time, you're better off to rip out those early ones and just be done with it and let your new ones harvest from. Because what happens when we have those older plants there, the plant for its part says, you know, I'm setting tomatoes. I can just let myself go. So they're actually going to drop some of their natural defenses, and they're not going to worry about it because their job's done. Plants are hardwired to reproduce. So that means to make fruit and seed. And once they've done that in their mind, they're done. That's why keeping things like peppers, especially picked, is one way to make sure we get the maximum harvest out of it. We let peppers stay on there for a long time, they're like, hey, I'm done. And so when we rip out those older plants, we can be taking pests out of the garden, or we could leave them there and create a nursery for things to grow on that can then infect the new plants we put out there. So once things are no longer productive in the garden, even in the middle of the season, I was just getting rid of the old ones. That also means we free up space so that we can put out a fall garden. Just as well as we can do a lot of early spring crops, we can do a lot of things as a fall garden. In fact, some things produce better as a fall garden than they do as a spring garden. So it gives us more flexibility if we're willing to get rid of the older, less productive things in the garden, and we are truly benefiting ourselves. The other thing to think about is weeds in the garden. So you may have a pasture field that's been a pasture for 50 years. You go out there, you plant broccoli, and all of a sudden you have harlequin bugs show up on your broccoli. Where in the world did those bugs come from? There hasn't been broccoli in that field ever. Well, there's native plants in the same family as broccoli. And you created a smorgasbord, and they found them. So the thing to understand is there's a lot of native plants, weeds, because they're not what we want in our vegetable garden, that can sustain diseases or insects in the environment. So keeping weeds out of the garden, managing the areas around the garden can be good. It's good to have refuge areas that can benefit beneficial things like pollinators as well as, you know, predatory insects. But understand those can also be refuge for diseases and negative insects. So just understand that. So when it comes to finding products for use, and I realize you're all going to be receiving some, it can get complex. It's more complex for certified operations because, for instance, a lot of gardeners have seen or are familiar with BT or Bacillus thuringiensis products. One common brand name, Dipel. It's a product that controls caterpillars. It does it really well. You have to understand how it works. The caterpillar has to eat it. It works better when they're younger caterpillars, but it really works well. It works so well that conventional agriculture uses it. There's actually some formulations of BT products that aren't approved for organics because it may have a surfactant or something like that, something that keeps it in suspension better, something that allows it to stick better to plants that is synthetic. So it's not the active ingredient, it's actually something else in the product. So we can't just say every BT spray is acceptable for organic because it's not. There are some that may have an included ingredient that doesn't work for true organic production. For most home gardeners, that's not a huge hang-up, but just be aware that happens. Most of the time, you will not see the USDA organic seal on there. Normally, when you see that on a product, you know, okay, this was certified organic. A lot of these products won't have it because, believe it or not, fertility products and pesticides don't fall under the USDA organic regulations. They're not considered agricultural products. Don't ask me what they are considered, because I don't know that, but they are not. For instance, there is not a USDA certified organic compost, because compost is not an agricultural product. Now, there are composts that are compliant with the regulations that you can purchase, but it's not truly certified. Next slide. And what you will see is more of this on products. So OMRI, O-M-R-I, Organic Materials Review Institute. This is a nonprofit. What they do is they actually evaluate products and say, do these products meet the organic regulations? That's all they do. They don't certify products. They just say these meet the regulations. Generally speaking, anything OMRI approved works for a certified organic operation. So we know it's good for an organic home garden. The other one we can hang our hat on actually comes from the EPA. You wouldn't know that to look at it, but that's exactly where this designation comes from. So you can see on the screen there, the little 3-leaf logo. Doesn't matter what color it's in, doesn't matter if it says organic gardening or organic production. If you see that on a pest control product, that has been determined by the EPA to be compliant with the regulations. And it also would be allowed for a certified operation to use. So, you know, as a home gardener, you're good to go on that. These are what you will most often find on products. There are other approvers of product. Washington State Department of Agriculture has a big program. California Department of Fisheries and Agriculture as well. But those don't necessarily show up on the label. These typically will. So that's why I included these. Going back to this slide. So the best disease control for our gardens is prevention. And so we talked a little bit about introducing things. We do, and I think I already mentioned this, but preventive versus curative. Most of these products are preventative in nature. In fact, that's one of the negatives about a lot of these organic products is we're going to be applying them frequently. Because they're natural, they don't last long in the environment. So things like UV radiation and stuff like that degrades them. And so we're going to be applying these products more frequently than we would conventional synthetic products. And so that is one of the caveats with this. The other thing is sometimes some of these can be rather expensive. At the home garden scale, probably not as big of an issue, but certainly for commercial organic operators, that's something that they watch very closely. Next slide. So with the preventative strategies, we want protection in place before diseases show up. So by and large, I think of these products almost like a shield. If the shield is there before it comes in, you're good. If it shows up after, you're lost. And so because of that, we do things, you know, in a preventive manner. We want to keep protection in place. Typically, once we start, we don't want to stop. It's a repeating spray interval. It can vary based on pattern. So, you know, if we're in very dry weather and it's for a fungal or bacterial leaf disease, we can probably reduce the frequency because the pressure wouldn't be so great. It's unlikely to be as successful to establish. By the same token, if we're having a lot of rain, you may be reapplying more frequently because the product is simply being removed. So understand that frequency. While we might think, okay, we'll spray on a 10-day interval or a 10 to 14-day interval, that can change depending on what's happening. And so a lot of these, once you start, you want to stick with it as long as there's still a likelihood that there's going to be a problem in the garden. And again, the label's the law. The other wrinkle to organic control products, just because it's allowed and approved doesn't mean it's effective. So we'll get to a reference publication in a minute, and it actually, especially on the disease side, I don't think it does on the insecticides, it actually summarizes what level of control there was, good, poor, fair, none, or is there no research? In some instances, we don't have good research to draw from. One of the things that I'm always charged with as an extension agent is to base my educational outreach on research that has happened, not just on a bribe from the fertilizer company or whatever. That's the point of it, is we're independent information that's backed up by science. Well, oftentimes with organics, we don't know. The science hasn't happened. And so because of that, sometimes it isn't clear, is it really worth spending your money on that product? But so that's the other caveat we just have to mention. I mentioned this earlier, we're going to be reapplying them more frequently. Another thing, understand how they work to a certain extent. So BT sprays, for instance, I mentioned earlier, a caterpillar has to eat it. You can spray the caterpillar with it, you can dunk it in there, it won't do anything. It has to consume it because literally what happens is it creates a deadly protein in their stomachs. If they do not eat it, it doesn't do any good. If you go out in your garden and you start looking, where do you find a lot of caterpillars at? Is it up on top of the plant? It's underneath the leaves. So you have to make sure that your sprays are actually getting underneath those leaves where the caterpillars are actually munching, so they'll actually eat it and die. You can put a BT product through your irrigation system. Won't kill a thing. You got to understand how these work to a limited extent. Don't have to know complex science, but just like that, it has to eat it, has to be where they're eating. As long as you understand that, you can have good control of that problem. All right. We do, again, want to mention, we want to use these safely. With most homeowner products, we don't see a lot of mention about personal protective equipment or PPE. So my rule of thumb would be wear goggles and gloves when mixed, because that's when the products are at their most concentrated. And again, some of these are, botanical in nature and things like that. When I was at the University of Kentucky, a guy was spraying an herbicide that was a clove oil-based herbicide. And the research areas, he was wearing goggles. Somehow or another, something got behind the goggle into his eye. He had to go get his eyes washed out. It was a natural, organic herbicide. But yet, there's still cautions with these. So just be aware of that. When applying, typically long sleeve and gloves, not, again, may not say it on the label because homeowner products don't necessarily carry the same language that commercial products do. Shoes, closed toes, don't be out there in sandals or Crocs. As much fun as they are to wear, probably not the proper footwear to be wearing when we're applying chemicals. Long pants as well. If we're overhead, so if we're doing fruit trees or something like that, maybe a mask. Certainly goggles might be warranted. The good thing is typically in a home garden, we're not using really high pressure sprayers. They're hand pump things. So that's less of an issue than we're talking about high pressure things, but still little common sense. We wouldn't, want to be using any sort of cleaner inside the house and get it all over us. By the same token, we don't want to do it with these pesticides. That's it. Yeah.
This might be a dumb question, but does it recommend using PPE when we are using fertilizer?
Fertilizers typically wouldn't be as big of a problem because basically, so the question was, is personal protective equipment recommended for fertilizer use? Typically, no, because most fertilizers are basically salts. And so, you might want gloves if you're distributing a product by hand, because later if you have cut hands, you'll find out why it's a salt. But honestly, there's less of a concern or a threat to us from fertilizer products. Were there any questions online? No. Okay. So we can go to the next slide. One thing I always say we should do, and part of this is because, again, we don't necessarily have real clear research on this all the way through, because one, some of these sprays have sublethal effects. Research is showing that some pesticides, and this would be across the board, conventional or organic, any number of these might have synergistic effects where product A and product B separately cause no problems, spray them both in the same area. Now we've got problems for pollinators. So it's not always well understood, but I would default to say, let's assume that these sprays are going to have negative impacts on beneficial insects or pollinators. And so because of that, we'd like to spray like late in the evening at dusk. I know what some of you are thinking. You just said don't get plants wet late in the evening because they won't dry. Comparatively, irrigation versus pest control, we're using much less water, so it's not as big of a deal. But again, we're doing it specifically to try to protect those beneficial pollinators. So And the reason we spray at dusk, if you're ever outside as it's going dark, you'll notice bees have already gone home. And so that's why we spray that time. We also obviously want to spray when there's no wind, because we don't want to be spraying over here and have the wind take it somewhere else. That's a problem, conventional or organic. Another thing to be aware of, try to only mix as much as you need for the area you have. Dealing with leftover pesticide, even organic pesticides is a problem. We don't want to be pouring these down the drain. We don't necessarily just want to be dumping them somewhere. So the best way to get rid of a pesticide that you have is to use it in a way that you can. So spray it on something that it's labeled for. So a lot of these products you could use in the landscape or even on the lawn. So if you do make too much, you can go ahead and distribute them that way. And then again, storage is important, especially with biological products. We don't necessarily want them really hot or really cold because they're living products and can actually be killing those organisms. And again, disposal, these are still pesticides, so we don't just need to be dumping them somewhere. Next slide. This is a good product. I'm not going to go into it in depth. We've got several slides in here. This is a product that UT put out. It's a great publication because basically it just lists a number of different organic and conventional products that are available to homeowners for home vegetable gardens. And it tells you what they're good for and gives you some directions basically. Go ahead and just click through a couple of slides. And you can just see it lists the product, active ingredient, some commercial products that contain that active ingredient, pests that it controls. And because this is the disease one, you will see those little, can't read that I'm sure, but it has a little superscript notation about what level of control it offered for specific disease, and then some different notes about it. Really good information. Just go ahead and click.
We do give out Serenade and the Monterey neem oil.
Okay, good.
So that's
Good
what you
to know.
guys will be getting in a couple weeks.
You can keep going.
Okay.
Because that's just to show you it's there. There's good information. This is another one. So this one will mention organic products, but it's not organic focused or anything, but it's just our basic home vegetable garden disease control book. So if you know what your problem is, you can look up in here and see what your options are, conventional or organic. The one we just looked at actually goes into more detail, so probably a little bit better, but this can be a good reference too. So we talked about earlier, there's kind of the different categories. There are mineral sprays. Among those, copper is one that's used very commonly. There's conventional products that use copper. It's probably one of our better bacteria and even fungicides available to organic producers. So it gets used a lot. We can build up toxicity of copper in the soil in theory. If you're using it as needed at labeled rates, it's probably not a huge issue for most home gardens. Potassium bicarbonate, this is not baking soda, that's sodium, can also be a good fungal control product, very effective on powdery mildew. But again, we see the thing where a frequent reapplication interval, weekly or after heavy rains. So it can work, but again, it also gets washed off.
Just making sure there's no questions.
Botanical-based products, and there's any number of different ones of these. Neem oil is probably the most prevalent one out there on the market. Think about neem oils, there's different kinds of neem oils. So the active ingredient that works on the insecticide of neem oil is as a directant. So there's actually products that aren't neem oil, but they have extracted the azadirachtin from it, and that's the active ingredient. So it's actually an insect growth regulator. It can mess up how insects develop. Great activity, can work well. There's clarified neem oils that basically just act like a horticultural oil. So if you've ever grown fruit or seen recommendations for utilizing dormant oils, basically it's just a literal oil that smothers. And so this can be used in that manner if it's a clarified product, it's just an oil. So that can work. It can kill any number of different insects. It can protect from some diseases possibly, but just be aware there's different forms. So if you're wanting one that has that insecticidal properties that affects their ability to develop, make sure it's not clarified, make sure it has the azuractin still in it, because that's the active ingredient that does that. Thyme oil is another one that is on the market, not as commonly used, so probably wouldn't be one that you'd first reach for. Serenade is one of the biological sprays, and there's more and more of these on the market. Be aware again, some of these are actually literally living biology. So again, pay attention to storage recommendations. This is one you may not want to buy the biggest jug on the shelf because it's not going to last forever. It's a living organism, so you may want to look at buying a new one every season. So a smaller size may make more sense. The theory is basically with a lot of these living organisms is you're putting them out there in the environment, it's taking that place away from the bad organisms. So it's removing the niche in the environment, and that prevents infection. Some activity on some diseases, but certainly wouldn't work for everything. You just have to be aware of that. Best practices when it comes to disease control, we'd say the same thing about insect control. Alternate different products to vary the mode of action. So mode of action is just how do these products work? We can actually build resistance in a pest if we just use one way to kill them, essentially. Because what we do is we remove all the susceptible members of the population, and the ones that are left are the ones that, for whatever reason, are no longer susceptible to that mode of action or the way it kills them. So by rotating through different modes of action, we prevent resistance. This is something we do with conventional agriculture. Still a good idea to do it with organic production as well. Also, you can consider doing some things like adding insecticidal soap into your spray. So I mentioned earlier the BT products. A good thing to do with those whenever you're spraying BT on your crucifers, so your broccoli, cabbage, all those, is to add in either insecticidal soap as a surfactant or adding surfactant from the market in there. The reason being, if you think about those brassicas, they kind of have waxy leaves. Water likes to run off of those. And so what a surfactant can do is improve the ability of that product to stick to those leaves. We can substitute insecticidal soap, which is an effective insect control product. We're not breaking any label rules by doing this, so we kind of get bang for our buck that way. Yes.
Do you have to spray cabbage, broccoli if you net them and put them when you plant them?
In theory, no. However,
What was the question?
True.
Can you repeat it?
okay, so the question was, if you are utilizing like a floating row cover or netting that would prevent the moths from accessing those cabbage, broccoli, etc., do you have to spray for those caterpillars? Maybe. So true story from college again. So one of our entomology classes, we were doing some different things, and one of the things we did is we actually had plants growing outside. Some of them were in cages covered in remade. Those plants got ate. What they figured out, and what the professor came down to, he said what had to have happened is, a lot when you take plants from the greenhouse out to the garden, you harden them off. You leave them outside. They're out there to get more used to that environment, so you don't just go from the lovely greenhouse out to the harsh world. They think what happened is a moth, a diamondback moth or whatever, actually found those plants, laid eggs, and then we went and put them in a protective little enclosure. So in theory, absolutely, if you can exclude the moth from laying eggs on those plants, you don't need to spray for caterpillars. The problem is that they may already be there. They're tiny little eggs, little tiny eggs. So, I mean, that's where, no. In fact, exclusion is a great way in integrated pest management using floating row covers. Excellent way to remove insect pressure. But you have to do a good job with it. You can't take a plant that already has the eggs on it and stick it under there. Really doesn't work then. So, I mean, that's some of the complexity that anything we're talking about. If you do a horrible job with a great spray, it's not going to give you good results. So sometimes it's how well you execute the strategy. Very much. So it's a good discussion question. So
Do you have any recommendations for squirrels?
Recipes? So when it comes to rabbits, squirrels, groundhogs, raccoons, deer, they're very hard to fence out. You know, trapping might work. Certainly lethal options might be an option. There's not a shortage of squirrels. But I mean, no, there's not a good product to say, oh, spray this and they won't come back. It just doesn't exist. Generally, with those types of pests, exclusion or removal is your two options, and exclusion is very difficult.
You keep talking about like spraying and plants and stuff, and my brain is just weird. So I had the thought of, would it work to put some, like we start seeing like, hey, we're getting a lot of a particular thing cropping up in our garden, and we're making our own compost. Can you put any of those like insecticides in with your compost as you're composting them for 10 to 14 days in the heat and spinning them, and would that help?
Okay, so the question was, what other strategies besides just out there spraying products could we use with these products for pest control? So that would work if these products work systemically in the plant. So how many people have heard of hemlock woolly adelgid or hemlock trees?
Yes.
There's a little insect that gets on them, kill them, has the little white spots. You see that along the limbs, that's what it is. To control that, we use systemic insecticides. What systemic insecticides do is enter into a plant and then they translocate. They move throughout the plant. So the pesticides we use for that, those insecticides, work that way. None of these organic products are going to work that way. So for instance, the BT, we can't water our transplants with BT water and it take it up, and now when the caterpillar eats on it, it dies. It doesn't act that way. It doesn't have that mode of activity or mode of action. So basically the answer is not really, because these are not going to go from our potting soils or, you know, from the top of the soil into the plant. It's not how they act. It's just not their nature. So it's not a bad question, because in fact, systemic insecticides or disease control agents work well, just none of these have the ability to do that.
I guess my second question that there would be, and maybe you just haven't gotten to it yet. Some things that I've been reading, there are certain plants like flowers like marigold or something that we can plant into the garden that will prevent certain insects from coming in, or they deter certain insects. Is that something that we could use to?
So companion planting
Okay.
is what you're talking about. This, how do we use companion planting? There's not real good research that shows it's actually effective. So there are in fact specific marigolds that can be very effective in killing certain nematodes, for instance. But to do that, you have to have a complete bed of marigolds growing there. So part of your rotation strategy, if you have nematodes, you could do that. There is, you know, if we have those refuge or pollinator plantings there that can get, for instance, you know, beneficial insects into the garden, that possibly would work. But the ideal that we can plant specific plants and that just completely prevents an insect from coming or going, it just isn't borne out by the research. So I would say that would not be my primary way. I do think, you know, having those refuge area pollinator plantings are good. There's nothing wrong with that. They certainly wouldn't be problematic, but I don't think most of the time that's going to be highly effective if we have high, especially with diseases. I don't think it'd be effective, but even with insects, if you have high insect pressure, you have a lot of the pests nearby, they're still going to come. There's a very few diseases it could almost work with. So there are some viruses that are called stylet-borne viruses. Literally, they're in the mouth parts of the insect. So they feed on an infected plant, then they feed on your plant. If you put another plant in between that's not effective, it cleans out their mouth parts. That would work, but that's a very limited number of diseases it would work for, and that's highly specific. So by and large, especially with diseases, I don't think companion planting strategy is going to offer you a lot of control. One thing we need to think about with diseases, and we probably could have put this earlier, but vectors. And vectors are just how these diseases live. Obviously, infected plant materials can bring them into our garden. That can also be seed. There are some seed-borne diseases. Insect vectors are a big one for a number of different diseases. Weed vectors, we mentioned earlier, they can reside on weeds. Lots of times they can, a weed that is persisting over winter is that overwintering site. There are certainly soil-borne diseases that when they're in our soil, they remain there for some amount of time. There are actually airborne diseases that blow in every year to our region. And then, of course, human vectors. I mentioned earlier about tobacco use, but certainly there are bacterial diseases that if we go out in our garden when it's wet with dew and we're working with plants, if one plant has a bacterial problem, we can very quickly and easily spread that because the plants are wet. Broadly speaking, we have a couple of different issues when it comes to disease or causal organisms. Viruses. So basically, these are mostly spread either by insects or in infected plant or seed material. Bacteria loves water. So the wetter it is, typically, the more bacterial problems we have. Insects can actually move bacteria around. It can be in the soil. It can be blown in the wind. And certainly we ourselves can move bacteria around as well. Fungi, we have different kinds of fungi. Some must have a living host. Some can live on dead matter. Some can live on both. And so it just depends which fungi we're talking about. We do have great conditions for really almost all these diseases. Bacterial and fungus are more sensitive to environment, I think, than viruses, simply because viruses get moved so readily. We may not have a lot of problems, but if an insect has the virus, they can bring it in, even if our environment wouldn't necessarily enhance it to happen. So certainly with our high temperatures, high humidity, we can have a lot of disease problems. Doesn't mean we have to, but there actually is certainly pressure. We'll go through a few diseases. These are just a few. It's not everything that's out there, but these are some that we may see, and we'll talk a little bit. So downy and powdery mildew. You probably guessed by the names which one is powdery. The one on the right, it looks like powder was dusted on your plant. Don't get confused with some of your cucurbit crops. And I think this shows it. This is not powdery mildew on the bottom of that picture. There are cucurbits that have that lighter coloration, especially on the veins of their leaves. That is not what it looks like. It literally looks like powder. If you've ever grown zinnias, you've probably seen powdery mildew, as you have some of the newer varieties. Powdery mildew is ubiquitous across the landscapes. Trees get it. It's all over the place. It's not that hard to kill. Downy mildew, much more destructive. Certainly, we can have a loss of production because of powdery mildew if we do nothing, but downy mildew is a bigger problem. There's actually an entire network of sentinel plots and notifications for commercial growers of cucurbits because of downy mildew. Downy mildew affects a number of different plants, different specific species. Blue mold of tobacco, people may have heard of that, is actually a downy mildew. So, yes.
If we see our plants have that, but it's like harvest time opposed to, we just pick our vegetables and eat them and just be done with that.
Yeah, so there's none of these pests that we're talking about that have any sort of carryover to the human host. So the basic question was, if we have a plant that's infected with one of these diseases, do we have to be concerned about harvesting from it? Absolutely not. And in fact, downy mildew comes in later in the season, anywhere from mid-July on. So depending what crop we're actually growing, I know some producers commercially that they put out their winter squashes as early as they can, hopefully to get them right before downy mildew kills them. And most of the time they get away with it. So certainly, we can do some things on timing like that to where we may not be out there actively controlling. We're just betting we're going to get a harvest before the plant is unable to fulfill its role. Both of these can be spread in by wind. So again, leaf wetness is a bad thing, but humidity alone can enhance both of these diseases. So airflow alone is probably not enough. Resistant varieties, where possible, is a good option. I don't think there is for downy, there may be for powdery. Planting successions, this is one of those things, as plants get older, their defenses do go down. So if you're wanting to get the longest, if you're picking off a yellow squash for 6 or 8 weeks, it's not going to last for 10 or 12. 6 or 8, you're doing well with that, especially in an organic system. So plan, if you want season-long harvest off a yellow squash, plant multiple times in succession, so that as those first plants start going down, your next harvest is coming on. Powdery mildew is much easier to control because it actually lives on top of the leaf surface. So there's actually any number of products that are effective to it in controlling it, because literally this is one we probably could say we almost have curative products for, because it's very vulnerable to our control agents. Downy mildew is much more difficult to control, but it is later to arrive, and so that sometimes gives us that window where we get some production without worrying about it. But it is one that once we start spraying for downy, we probably want to keep spraying, because downy mildew will very quickly knock out an entire crop. Early blight on solanaceous vegetables. Most often we see this on tomatoes. We've got the brown lesions, and if you notice, they kind of have concentric rings, kind of a bullseye or a target spot. Fairly common, starts on the lowest or oldest leaves on the plant and works its way up. You can go ahead and flip to the next slide. So we can actually, when we start seeing this come in, remove those lower leaves that are infected to help limit the spread. It's coming from our soils typically. So this is one where if we have a good mulch layer down, this can prevent soil from splashing on the leaves and preventing infection. There are resistant varieties. North Carolina State has done a number of different varieties that have good resistance to this. Some of them are pretty darn remarkable. They're using commercial with good success. Copper is a good control agent, and serenade may also have some activity. And typically we're looking at about a weekly spray schedule. So this is one that is not uncommon. A lot of people talk about their plants getting blight. If it truly is blight, this is probably the one they get. But there's also other bacterial diseases that can look similar, but this one is commonly seen. Late blight, somewhat similar looking, but it happens under very different environmental conditions. So late blight, this is the one I mentioned earlier that most often comes in on infected plants because it needs cool, wet conditions. Certainly have wet summers, but they're also hot. So years where we see this, we are not having our typical weather patterns. Get the next slide. Again, good airflow is important. Choose resistant varieties if available. Good cleanup and sanitation on any of these diseases that goes across the board. When we know we have a disease or insect problem, don't put those plants in the compost pile. Unless you are monitoring your compost pile with a thermometer and keeping records, you're not going to get it hot enough to kill it. You've got a pile of dead stuff, and that's okay, as long as we're not putting in disease-causing organisms. But if we're putting in disease-causing organisms, we're just giving them a place to hide out till we feed them next year on new garden plants. So don't put diseased or insect-infested plants in the compost pile. And again, serenade and copper are probably our best control agents. Yes.
What about animal manure if you don't get your pile high enough?
So the question on was animal manure and how hot your pile is. So if you're not keeping records, I would say treat compost with animal manure in it as raw manure. We can use raw manure in our garden as long as we pay attention to when we're using it there. From the organic regulation, there's the 120 and 90 day rule, which says we can use raw manure in organic production, provided we incorporate it into the soil. And if the product we're harvesting is in contact or close proximity to the soil, we have to do that at least 120 days prior to harvest. So if we've got melons on the ground, if we've got tomatoes low, they're likely going to get soil splashed. If we have greens on the ground, we would want to use raw manure no later than 120 days before harvest and make sure it's incorporated into the soil. The 90-day rule says if we're talking about sweet corn, it's up elevated off the ground, much less likely to have that interaction between the soil and manure and that product. So we can do it 90 days before harvest. So utilizing uncomposted manure or compost that we know hasn't necessarily reached the proper temperature, from a food safety standpoint, it's all about time.
Is that 120 days work for root vegetables?
Yeah, yes, because they're in contact. Yeah, direct application to the soil would be direct application to the root vegetable. Good point. Next slide. There's a number of different leaf spots we can get. Septoria is one we see often. Dark brown circles, light tan in the middle. Next slide. It will affect basically peppers, tomatoes as well, even potatoes, so all the nightshades or solanaceous crops, and even celery. Typically, this is one that's not necessarily going to kill the plant, but it definitely reduces its productive capacity. So this is one that, depending on the time of season, you may or may not feel it's important to control. Again, we can remove the leaves and destroy those. Good sanitation, and again, copper and serenade, we've seen that pop up repeatedly. Wilts, and what a wilt is, you notice your plants in the heat of the day look wilted. They're not getting enough water, but then overnight or the next morning, they're perked back up. Most often, you probably got something happening. It could be one of these wilts. It could be some other root diseases that are reducing the capacity of that plant to take up water. But Fusarium and Verticillium, some differences, but not anything that we have to worry about. But the basic symptom is they're wilting. And then the plant basically starts drying up. It's not getting enough water. These can actually affect not just our solanaceous crops. These will persist in the soil for years. So this is one that we want to be careful with. There are a lot of resistant varieties out there, so that's a good thing for us. Mulching, again, can be beneficial because it prevents the soil from splashing on the leaves, but these have the ability to enter into the root systems as well. We can try some things like solarizing soil, which is where we cover soil with plastic for a period of time and basically bake it. That's a negative thing because it is killing off good as well as bad, but it's a great way to try to deal with this if we know we have infested soils. So not a bad plan if you know you've got a problem to try solarizing. Best time to solarize is actually during the summer, after those sun. So it could remove you from producing in that area that summer. There's any number of soft rots that can affect our root vegetables. Basically, a lot of this is coming in either on the plants or the propagules, so seed potatoes, for instance. Rotation is important. Again, if we bring it in, but then it's not able to grow and reproduce year after year, we want to reduce the likelihood of seeing it. Adding organic matter to our soil is a good thing because it helps improve the drainage of our soils. And when we do have crops, once they do reach maturity, go ahead and harvest those. And I realize, some of our root crops we can let sit in soil, over winter and keep them heavily mulched, and we'll harvest from them. But don't do that if your soils aren't very well drained. If you know your soils hold water a lot, I'd suggest not doing that. Just go ahead and pull them and find them a way to store them outside of the garden. So moisture is a big one with this. Bacterial wilts, primarily on cucurbits. Again, the plants wilt. You can actually cut the stem and then cut two parts apart and stick them together. If you see threads connecting them from the sap, that's very diagnostic on this. And so you go ahead and hit the next slide. This is one that's actually an insect problem, even though it's a disease. So it's actually vectored or carried by our cucumber beetles. And there you see the striped and the spotted. I'll let you decide which one is which. The really bad thing is there's not a good organic control option for these beetles. Floating row covers early in the season on our cucurbit plants is important. The kaolin spray surround might deter these some. I say might because I don't think there's good research, and I've known some growers that say they didn't feel it was effective. The problem with using row covers is when these start blooming, we've got to pull those row covers off. These have to have pollination to make fruit. And so generally speaking, this is something that you can crop these plants, but they won't last as long as they should. So this is one that when we talk about insects at a future date, I don't have good control options for cucumber beetle in organic production. So it just kind of is what it is, but certainly row cover over young plants can at least hopefully get you as robust of a plant as possible before you have to remove that cover. Cucumber mosaic virus, and there's other viruses. Typically with virus, you see distorted growth or colors. So sometimes they kind of look kind of neat, but it's bad because it's reducing the productive capacity of the plant, could cause off flavors, and it probably wouldn't have any sort of shelf life associated with it. So definitely not something we want to see. These viruses don't just hit cucumbers, despite the name. This is transmitted by aphids or infected plant material. So this is one where if you had this virus outside the garden in wild weeds, this is one that could be brought in by aphids if they come into the garden. If you see these, pull them out. Virus infected plants need to be destroyed. Don't leave them in the garden. There is no treatment. There's nothing we can do. Best thing we can do is see if there are resistant varieties out there. And there are some resistance to some viruses. Anthracnose, this is one you'll notice we have two different crops there, a pepper and a watermelon. This can infect any number of different plants in our garden. And you kind of see that distinctive spotting on, in this case, the fruit. It can also infect leaves and stems. Next slide. Nightshade, so again, our peppers, tomatoes, potatoes, but also cucurbits, beans even. Anthracnose is not uncommon on green beans. Again, soil splashing, if we can reduce that, we're benefiting ourselves. Minimizing leaf wetness or fruit wetness is again important. And if we see we have a problem, this is another one. It's not a bad idea just to pull that plant out. Copper is probably our best option when it comes to control. So I like giving people resources to look at, because me standing in front of you talking, you're not going to get everything I say. I don't get everything I say all the time either. So, but if you have a smartphone, you open up your camera and point it at the screen, and this will actually work online too. It's going to ask you if you want to open up a Google Drive document. That document is there to the side, and so it's a PDF that has a ton of clickable links on it. This is my big collaboration of vegetable gardening links and resources that I provide to folks. There's everything from the specific publications I've already mentioned this evening. At the bottom, there's some really good University of Kentucky IPM scouting guides. They have good pictures in it. And one of the big things I think that's important with organic gardening, you do have to be out there looking, because you need to catch the problems as early as possible. So be out there flipping over leaves, looking down at plant rosettes, trying to find when you have 10 aphids on there, as opposed to when you have 800. When you've got 10, you can probably do something to take care of it, including maybe pulling the leaf off. When the whole plant is covered and every plant in the patch is covered, it's already too late. And so scouting, actually out there inspecting your plants, flipping leaves over, getting down on your hands and knees, using your reading glasses if you're of that age, is important, because these things are living. But a lot of great resources. So I think you'll find something on there useful to you. The other thing is got my contact info at the top. Go ahead and hit the next. Oh, and there's the link to tiny.utk.edu/veggarden. So if you are on your smart device online and thinking, well, how am I supposed to take a picture of the screen, you moron? There's the link to it. So you can actually get through that one too. This is me. If you got problems, if you got questions, that's why we're there. So, it's one of those things. I do make house calls. We don't charge. We can send off samples to get positive diagnosis. Most of the time, there is a charge for that, unfortunately. Most of the time, for most homeowners, that's not critical. We can figure out basically what it is. If we're slightly wrong, we're probably still close enough in the ballpark and we get you a control option. But certainly we can send it off to the diagnostic lab. I can actually submit pictures free of charge. but most of the time they won't conclusively diagnose something, just pictures. To actually diagnose most of these diseases, you actually have to see the spores from the disease before they'll give you a conclusive diagnosis, which is worth the $20 if you've got, a quarter acre or something. If it's your backyard garden, probably isn't, quite honestly. So I don't push people that direction unless they want to. That is my cell phone number. Send me pictures. You can have questions. It's a great way. Hey, what's this bug? Is it a good bug or a bad bug? I get more bad pictures than good ones. So if you have something lovely in your garden, send me that. It'll cheer me up. So I literally see death and destruction most days. But there's my office number. You're welcome to call me on my cell. There's my email. Use it. And with that, any further questions? Yes, sir.
I was thinking of you using diatomaceous earth for to help with ticks. We do a lot of ticks. I want to put it around like fence lines and all that. Can you tell me what your thoughts on that?
So the question was, what about diatomaceous earth? So as an insecticide, maybe specifically as a carriocide, that's what kills ticks. So the way diatomaceous earth works is diatoms are little bitty former ocean dwellers, calcium little things, and basically it's a bunch of little razor blades that cuts up the outer coverings of insects and they desiccate, they dry out and die. Works well if you have good direct contact between the diatomaceous earth and the insect. I don't know how effective it would be with ticks. I just don't know. So I mean, yes, the thought isn't off kilter, but I don't know, because I mean, to me, I think of animals bringing in ticks into your area. So is there going to be interaction between the diatomaceous earth and the ticks? Probably not necessarily, but if there was, it might work.
What about the safety of the garden?
Safety from the garden. So there's different grades of diatomaceous earth. There's like pool filter grades, there's food filter grade. Food filter grade, no problem, because literally in organic world, they will filter apple juice through it to remove, dissolved solids. So you get greater clarity, clearer juice. So if it's a food grade, absolutely no concerns. If it's a pool grade, I don't know. And so this gives me a good opportunity to say, I am not a fan of homemade pesticide recipes at all. So if you want to use an insecticidal soap, go buy an insecticidal soap. Don't mix one up from Dawn or Ivory or Palmolive or anything else. True story, back to college again. The turf grass folks, they were doing research on one caterpillar. And the way you bring it up out of the grass is you pour soapy water on it. Well, they were doing that, had been doing it for a couple of years, working great. All of a sudden they did it. Next week they had big giant squares of dead grass. They're like, uh-oh. They had changed the formulation of the soap. It wasn't the same soap they'd been buying for however many years. It was the same soap on the shelf, but the product inside the bottle had changed. Didn't have to tell you that. It's a soap, it's not an insecticide. And so because of that, to me, it's like you don't know how plants are going to react. It's not necessarily been tested on the plants, and it may be one of those something in there. A scent that causes the problem, some sort of surfactant or something that would never be in a true insecticidal soap. So I'm not a big fan of homemade any sort of pesticides. I don't think it's worth the risk to the plants.
Have you ever heard of the 7 dust?
Yeah. So 7 dust used to be the insecticide carbaryl. It's an organophosphate. It's an old one. Very broad spectrum, sort of toxic to even higher species. Most 7 products now do not contain carbaryl, even though they're still called 7. They're actually totally different products. So we looked at the active ingredients. So 7 itself obviously is not an organic product. I can't remember what they replaced it with as the active ingredient. It's not in my head right now. But it obviously follow all label directions. But and that's it. To me, when it comes to pesticide use, whether we're talking organic products or not, we all know Tylenol is a great pain relief. We also know we don't turn the bottle upside down. We follow the label directions, because if a little bit's good for you, too much will kill you. In my mind, when it comes to pesticide safety, the same thing. Follow the label rate, follow the directions, you're gonna have problems when you go outside of that. Any other questions? Yes.
Can you recommend like a weed killer? We have like some fence lines, but we can't weed wrap basically, that's organic.
So organic, no. So here's the problem with organic weed killers. Most of the ones that you would see available to you would be like concentrated vinegars. They will kill plants off at the ground level. Different botanical oils, same thing, they'll burn a plant back. The problem is they don't kill the plant there, they just knock the top off. And so it regrows from the root. So very few commercial organic operations utilize any organic herbicides. It's just not worth the money and time because you're having to go back and respray so often. Might as well go through and do physical control, whether it's tillage, flaming, something like that. So I mean, honestly, no, there is not a highly effective or certainly not cost-effective organic herbicide where you can spray it and you've got season-long control or anything like that. It just simply doesn't exist.
Non-organic, to recommend on the garden?
Well, and I know glyphosate has a terrible image.
What does?
Glyphosate or Roundup, the active ingredient in Roundup is glyphosate. It actually works well. It's good. The one complaint the ag community would have with Roundup is that it doesn't last long enough. So you can use Roundup to kill an area. You can plant back into it 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, depending on specifically what you're talking about. It doesn't last in the environment. It gets broken down. And I realize there's been court cases and everything like that. Courts and science are not always the same thing. And I'll just leave it at that. Again, if you don't want to use it, don't. But certainly there's not any herbicide I would point to and say, oh, well, there's absolutely no concern with that. I mean, just like if we think about the things we have under our sink for cleaning, how many of us want those on the salad? Nobody. But we clean the dish, we put the salad. So if you think about things, sometimes it's like, I don't want to be eating glyphosate, but at the same time, we've got things that we use that are probably, in truth and in actual fact, more toxic than anything we might be spraying outside. Caffeine, believe it or not, is toxic to us. Interesting. But
Did they take out that ingredient in Roundup that was supposed to be bad?
nope, because the EPA that regulates all pesticides said, yeah, no, it's not a problem.
Oh, okay.
Again, a court case doesn't necessarily have the impact of the law. And so,
'Cause I bought some Roundup and I said it does to try to maintain stuff.
and so, I mean, and the thing with, again, it goes back to what I said earlier, even our organic products, we're going to follow label directions. We're going to assume this could have a negative impact on our positive species. So we're going to use it in a way to be as minimally impactful as possible. I would do that no matter what product I use. Any other questions? Thank you all, and please feel free to reach out to me.
Thank you.